Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into some seriously cool literary stuff today. We've got this whole list of works and authors, and I'm really pumped to kind of dig in and see what we can find. Maybe even rediscover some old favorites, who knows?
Yeah, and the really cool thing about all these pieces is that they're not just like, old stories. They can teach us about people and how they act, how societies work, and they're still relevant today.
For sure. Okay, so let's jump right in, shall we? We've got this question here about Percy Bysshe Shelley and Adonis. Now, I vaguely remember elegies from back in school, but I never really grasped what made them so unique.
Right. Well, elegies are like way more than just poems about someone dying. They're about grappling with those big questions,
Mhm.
life and death and what we leave behind. Take Adonis, for instance. It's not just Shelley being sad about Keats dying, it's him exploring this idea that maybe art itself is a way to live on, to achieve a kind of immortality. And that idea, you see it popping up in so many elegies over the centuries. It's what gives them that incredible lasting power.
That's a really interesting perspective. It makes you think about how art can like transcend time and connect with us on such a deep level, right? And speaking of works that connect with us, let's move on to Charles Dickens. I've always loved his books because they really get into those tricky moral choices people have to make.
Oh, absolutely. Dickens was amazing at showing characters grappling with these really tough dilemmas. I mean, think about Pip in Great Expectations or Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities. Their struggles with what's right and wrong, selfishness versus sacrifice, it makes us think about our own values.
Oh, I totally get that.
Mm.
When I read Great Expectations, I felt so invested in Pip's journey, like I was right there making those choices with him. It's so powerful. It reminds me of other Victorian authors who were also dealing with social issues. There's a question here about John Ruskin and his work on social economy. What can you tell us about that?
So, Ruskin was super concerned about how industrialization and capitalism were impacting society. In one of his major works, Unto This Last, he actually challenges those dominant economic theories of the time. He argues for a more ethical way of looking at work and wealth. It's really fascinating to see how he connects art and morality to these big societal issues.
It shows how great literature can really reflect the worries and hopes of the time, doesn't it? Speaking of which, this next one is intriguing. The Pond Poets.
Hmm.
Who were they, and why on earth were they called that? It sounds kind of funny.
Right. Well, pond poets, as kind of dismissive as it might sound, actually points to how central nature was to the poetry of guys like Wordsworth and Coleridge. They lived up in the Lake District in England, surrounded by incredible scenery. And those landscapes became like essential to their writing. It's almost like the lakes themselves are characters in their poems.
That makes me want to grab a Wordsworth book and hop on a plane to the Lake District right now. But for now, let's switch gears from peaceful lakes to, well, war. There's a question here about Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade.
Ah, yes. This poem captures the sheer drama and tragedy of the Crimean War. Tennyson uses these incredible images and rhythms to put you right there on the battlefield. You can practically feel the chaos, the courage, and the awful cost of war. It's a poem that's both epic and intensely personal all at once.
It's amazing how poetry can transport us to different times and places like that and make us feel these emotions so strongly. Speaking of intense emotions, this next one is about Keats and how he got inspired by a very specific piece of art, the Elgin Marbles.
Right, so the Elgin marbles, these sculptures from the Parthenon in Athens, they really sparked something in Keats. They led him to write Ode on a Grecian Urn, this poem that's all about beauty and art and how time passes. It's like Keats is looking at these ancient sculptures and thinking about how fleeting life is, contrasted with the lasting power of art.
It's fascinating how art can inspire more art, even across centuries in different forms. It's like an ongoing conversation, always evolving. And speaking of evolution, let's move on to another question about a particular type of poetry, the dramatic lyric.
Oh, Robert Browning, he was a master of that style. In poems like My Last Duchess and Porphyria's Lover, he creates these incredibly intense psychological portraits, but he does it through the voices of his characters. It's like you're overhearing their deepest thoughts and feelings.
That sounds so intimate, so powerful. Okay, we got another one about Robert Southey, but this time it's about him being poet laureate. Can you tell us a bit more about that role?
Sure, the poet laureate's an honorary position in Britain appointed by the monarch. Historically, it meant writing poems for special occasions and royal events. Southey got the gig in 1813, which shows how important he was in the literary world back then. He was famous for these long narrative poems, and he loved digging into history and mythology. You can see that in works like Thalaba the Destroyer and The Curse of Kehama.
Wow, it's incredible to think about the history and tradition behind that title. And speaking of history and tradition, we can't leave out William Shakespeare and Hamlet, right? What makes this play such a classic example of tragedy?
Well, Hamlet tackles some of the most fundamental questions about being human. Revenge, betrayal, death, even the meaning of life itself. Hamlet's struggle with all this, his descent into madness, and the tragic consequences that come after, it all makes the play timeless and so relevant to us even now.
Every time I read or see Hamlet, it seems to hit differently. It's like it grows and changes as you do. Okay, let's shift gears to a more modern author, Ernest Hemingway. What makes The Old Man and the Sea such a enduring classic?
On the surface, it's this simple story about an old fisherman fighting a giant marlin. But beneath that, it's about resilience, about fighting when things seem impossible, and about finding meaning even when the world feels indifferent.
It's a good reminder that even the simplest stories can pack a punch. And speaking of impact, let's talk about Jonathan Swift and his satirical masterpiece, Gulliver's Travels.
Swift, oh, he was a satirical genius. In Gulliver's Travels, he uses these wild voyages to different lands to critique, well, everything, really. Human nature, society, politics of his time, you name it. It's brilliant, often uncomfortable, and it makes us look at our own flaws and hypocrisy.
Sounds like a book that's both entertaining and makes you think.
Yeah.
Okay, back to Dickens for a moment. What about the Pickwick Papers?
So that's one of his earlier novels, full of humor and adventure, but also that classic Dickens social commentary. It follows Mr. Pickwick and his friends as they travel around England, meeting all these eccentric characters and getting into all sorts of scrapes. It's lighter than some of his later stuff, but it still gives you a glimpse into Victorian society and what it means to be human.
It sounds like a fun journey into Dickens' world. And speaking of journeys, let's touch on Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre.
Jane Eyre, that was a groundbreaking novel. It's a coming-of-age story, a romance, and a social critique all in one. Jane's quest for love, independence, and finding herself still resonates with people today, no matter their background.
It reminds us how powerful literature can be in giving a voice to those who are often ignored or silenced. Okay, let's step back in time to the Elizabethan age. Why was that period so important for literature and culture?
The Elizabethan age, named for Queen Elizabeth I, was a time of huge change and unrest, but it was also incredibly creative. The arts were booming, and we saw some of the biggest names in English literature emerge, like Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer. They literally shaped how we speak and write today.
It's mind-blowing to think about the lasting impact of that era. We've got one more about Wordsworth, this time his autobiographical poem, The Prelude.
The Prelude is like a journey through Wordsworth's life and how his connection to nature changed over time. It's a long one, but it's full of beautiful descriptions and deep thoughts about childhood, memory, and the power of imagination.
Makes me want to reread some Wordsworth and experience that nature connection for myself. Remember Shelley's Adonis we talked about earlier? Well, there's another question here about elegies. What else can you tell us about this poetic form that just keeps going?
Elegies have been around for centuries in so many cultures and languages, but they all share this core idea of wrestling with loss and sadness. They're a way to deal with those heavy emotions, find comfort in beauty and art, and remember those who are gone.
They show us that even when faced with death, we can still find beauty and meaning.
Yeah.
And speaking of meaning, let's wrap up with W.B. Yeats' The Second Coming.
The Second Coming, that's a haunting and almost prophetic poem. Yeats wrote it after World War I, and it captures that feeling of disillusionment and worry about the future. It's full of these apocalyptic images, this sense that the world is about to undergo some huge transformation.
It's one of those poems that stays with you. Now, before we go, let's swing back to Shakespeare for one last thought. We've got these questions about specific characters.
Yeah.
The villain in Hamlet, the one who kills Macbeth, and Hamlet's heroine.
Shakespeare was the best at creating complex, unforgettable characters. Claudius, the bad guy in Hamlet, he's driven by ambition and wanting power. Macduff, who takes down Macbeth, represents loyalty, justice, and things going back to how they should be. And Ophelia, Hamlet's heroine, she's often seen as a victim, but she's a character with so much depth and sadness. Her story shows us how messy love can be, the struggles of mental health, and how society's expectations can be so stifling.
What's so amazing about Shakespeare is that his characters feel real. They're flawed, they mess up, they experience joy and pain, and they remind us that we're all human, all going through similar things. So as you go about your day, think about the works we've talked about and how they connect to your own life. What resonates with you? What makes you see the world differently? Maybe this deep dive will inspire you to grab a book, discover a new author, or revisit an old favorite.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a whole new topic. See you then.
See ya.